made a suggestion for a program that was very similar to the title of this program. And George happened to mention that there had been a barber shop in back of the Antlers. The rear door to the Antlers, which is on 10th Avenue, there was a wall there. And on the left side was the bar. And when you went in that door, there was a barber shop. And so we thought, let's do a program on bars, because there were a lot of bars in Pinole 100 years ago. Barbers and some early characters of Pinole who gave Pinole its flair and its history. And so we came up with this program. And of course, George Vincent went to school with most of the people that you're going to see in this program. So most of the stories that he's about to relate are first-hand stories, things that he actually experienced himself. So with that, I give you Historical Society co-founder and director, and what would we do without him, George Vincent.
Thank you.
Right up there, top button.
I experienced myself, or I heard from my family, and of course the truth might have been stretched somewhat, but as Ronald Reagan once said, facts are disturbing little creatures. So some factual and some not. Before I get started, and before Jeff starts to show some of the PowerPoint pictures, I want to mention why Pinole attracted so many saloons. One thing you have to understand is Pinole was a sleepy little village. In 1903, when Pinole was incorporated as a city, there were only 665 individuals. So it was very small then, but most of what I'm going to talk about tonight is pre-World War I, because that was the heyday of saloons in Pinole. And one of the reasons for that, one of the big reasons, was in the late 1870s, the Northern Pacific Railroad came into Pinole. Northern Railway, thank you. There's a railroad buff here. And it later became the Southern Pacific Railroad down what we used to call the depot down by the bayfront in Pinole. With that, in 1879, came the California Powder Works. So then you had Pinole having an industrial base, going from a farming and an agrarian and a rural base with a small town to suddenly exploding with the California Powder Works and all the workers who came here. And it attracted many, many people to Pinole, especially single individuals, single men. So you had an explosion also in boarding houses and hotels in Pinole. The Pinole Hotel, where the Bank of Pinole is, was one of them. Most of them would burn down frequently, were rebuilt. And you had the American Hotel on 10th Avenue, which also burned down and almost burned the whole city of Pinole down in 1908. So you had many people coming into Pinole and many people from Pinole going to San Francisco for the first time, because you couldn't get many of the goods and services in this town in the 1870s. So you went by train to San Francisco to Jim's Cash Store, the Costco of its time, and you brought all of the things you needed and had them shipped here to Pinole to use for the rest of the year. There were small stores in Pinole, of course, but nothing to match what was in San Francisco. Conversely, you had many individuals coming from San Francisco to Pinole to sell their wares, or just to find out what Pinole was like and to settle here. So those are the main reasons why the saloons grew in Pinole. One of the early descriptions of Pinole pre-1900 was Pinole was a dirt road. San Pablo Avenue was just barely big enough for two wagons to pass each other. There were a few residential homes along San Pablo Avenue and about 13 saloons. That's just along San Pablo Avenue. 10th Avenue was a favorite spot for saloons also, as you'll see tonight. So with that, I would like to talk first of all about some of the early characters of Pinole, kind of on a historical basis. And then we'll get into the saloons, and then we'll get into some of the barbershops in early Pinole. So Jeff? The picture you see here. Oh, yes. Yeah, thank you, Jeff. Jeff looks out for my welfare. This individual was a frequent sight along the shorelines of Pinole pre-1900 to about 1913. This individual is either Riley or Sing Lee. The Chinese would rent the clam beds along the bayfront in Pinole from the Fernandez and Tennant families. They would get 20 to 30 boxes of clams a day, and they would ship them to San Francisco, sell them for about $3 a box. What makes this individual a character is this was Riley, and he would come from San Francisco with his fruits and vegetables over his what's called a yoke and bucket, very heavy, loaded with fruits and vegetables. He would sell them to the housewives in the different farms in Pinole, walking through Pinole and also along the dirt road to Rodeo, where he sold his wares. But he also had inside of his bucket a little box in which he kept peanuts. And the boys, the local boys of Pinole, would tease him by stealing the peanuts out of his box. Well, one day Riley outsmarted them. He put bees in the box. And when the boys opened the box, they never stole his peanuts again. The last we heard of Riley was he was walking between Pinole and Rodeo selling his wares, and he was robbed by robbers. And he came back to Pinole and told everyone about what happened. They formed a posse but never caught the robbers. He also would mark on everyone's fence posts how much they owed him, so that when he came back the next year, they could pay him the money they owed him.
How old was he?
How old was Riley? I have no idea, but probably in his 20s or 30s. Yes. The next individual, before Jeff goes on with that, that's of interest, a character in Pinole, was a fellow they called Dutch Henry. Now, Dutch Henry was a very gruff individual, German immigrant. He lived in a shack in Pinole, and the boys teased him by throwing rocks at his shack. He would come out swearing till the sky was blue with swear words. He was a big guy, 250 pounds, about 6'3", and he was no one to mess with. And Dutch Henry would go around to the different farms from September to January, and if you had hogs or pigs, he would stay there for a week or so and slaughter them and dress them into chops and hams and bacon and all the things that you needed. But he was not an individual to be messed with. So this was Dutch Henry. We don't have a picture of Dutch Henry. The next character we don't have a picture of either. To me, is one of the most interesting characters of Pinole. He actually lived outside of Pinole, pretty much where the Franklin Canyon Golf Course is today, along the road, along San Pablo Avenue, on the road to Martinez. His name was John Henry. And until he died, no one knew what his real name was, which was John Henry Davenant. Now, Pinole was part of Township number 11, which Rodeo and Hercules were also part of. So the constable of Pinole was the individual who was responsible for policing Pinole, Rodeo, and Hercules. So he had quite a job on his hands. As far as the bars went, when there were fights in the bars on Saturday nights, which many times there were, he would round up the drunks and they would be incarcerated in the local jail. And Pinole's jail was located at the end of Pear Street. And it was an old wooden rickety jail, and quite often the drunks, the floorboards are rotten in the bottom. They would dig themselves out even and escape. The more dangerous criminals were transported to the jail in Martinez. But John Henry Davenant had his own little saloon about 4 miles outside of Pinole. And everybody knew of John Henry. It was from about 1880 to 1910. And he was a hermit and a miser. And he kept to himself. And he served beer, and hot beer, 50 cents a glass. He had a ramshackle old cabin he lived in. Bernardo Fernandez let him stay there. And he didn't pay any rent. He had his own vegetable garden, his own cow. He kept to himself. He hated women. Apparently he had been through a divorce at one time, so he didn't like women at all. And people that talked to him said that if you engaged him and talked about women, then he got very, very belligerent for some reason. But his shack served more than warm beer. Whenever John Henry had to make change for a $5 gold piece, he would go in the back room and come back with change. But he never left the place. So everybody thought, gee, that guy's got a stash somewhere, a hoard somewhere. John Henry's got a hoard. And he lived in Rodeo what is called Indian Peak. If you go out the Franklin Canyon and look toward the east, you see this big high hill. That was Indian Peak. And John Henry lived across from that along the main road. Well, when John Henry had a stroke, the constable of Pinole came and they took him to Martinez, in the sanitarium in Martinez. He died there a couple of years later with dementia, but everyone knew that John Henry had buried a lot of money. And so they tore his shack apart. The people from Pinole went there, tore his shack apart, dug up the whole area. They figured he was worth $30,000 to $40,000. Never found any of it. So it's probably still there. John Henry's stash. Going from John Henry to another character of early Pinole in the 1920s, I read about this character. I did not know him. My father did not know him. His name was Tommy, and he lived on 3rd Avenue in a cabin in Pinole. And his friends built the cabin for him. And Tommy was a frequent character who frequented the streets and saloons of downtown Pinole. But Tommy had with him a unique companion. He had a blind dog named Matt. And Tommy and his blind dog Matt were frequent visitors to Pinole. And apparently at one time, he lived on 3rd Avenue, his friends moved him north to what we today call Craigers Point. Now, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Point Wilson in Pinole. We call it Point Wilson. When I was growing up, it was called Craigers Point. The reason being that the Crager family owned the ranch out there. Now, Mr. Crager, speaking of characters, was a very, very interesting individual. I've never seen a picture of him. I did see a picture of his daughter. Now, he passed away about 1913. His daughter, Elsie, used to wear animal skins and walk around town in animal skins. So she was quite a unique individual. I saw one picture of her, but no one would give me that picture or let me copy it. They were afraid that somehow they would be embarrassed by it. So anyway, this was Tommy, and they moved into his cabin to the Craigers Point. Unfortunately, the cabin and Tommy somehow caught fire, and Tommy and Matt both burned to death. Tommy was taken to Martinez. The poor dog was burned to death also. So a sad ending to another character in Pinole. One character, though, that I was familiar with, that I grew up with, and I think some of you in here are probably about my age or close to it, was this character. Look, Jeff, I did get it on. I got it on. The Walton family were early residents of Pinole. They operated the livery stable on Tennant Avenue in Pinole. There was Frank Walton. Now, he died of apoplexy about 1913. His brother Joseph Walton, or Joe Walton, and this was their son, Emmett Walton. Now, just about everyone in Pinole that was a character had a nickname. There was Spoons, a fellow named Spoons. There was Skunky Cardoza. But this was Emmett Pulley Pants Walton, because he had a habit of pulling on his pants. And this, when I was growing up, he was quite a character in town. He was one of the Walton family, and he always carried this cane with him with a silver knob. And he said, this was my family cane from the Castro's family, because he said his mother was a Castro of Hispanic background. He was very proud of that. Now, he had a very beautiful blonde wife, according to my mother's memory. And they lived in Fresno about 1929, but he fell on hard times and came back to Pinole and was divorced, and he lived with his dad, Joe Walton. And they lived over where the senior center is today. There's a high blue house there. That belonged to the Walton family that's rented out today. But where the senior center is, that was all part of the Walton estate over there. And they rented out homes and had a cherry orchard. Well, Emmett had all kinds of stories that he told. He talked like this. Hey, he had this funny voice. And he talked like this. Hey, Georgie. Called me Georgie. Everybody called me Georgie. Hey, Georgie, what are you doing? That's the way Emmett talked. He was talked like that. And one day I helped him home. Emmett liked to drink. And he was very inebriated one afternoon, and I helped him home to his house over by the senior center. And he says, no, don't go in there, knock on the door. I said, well, who's there? He says, you have to knock on the door and ask the cockroaches if I can come in first. It's so filthy. So that's the kind of character he was. Emmett used to hang out at Span's barbershop. That was his favorite hangout because he loved to tease Span. Span Vincent was a relative of mine who was a barber in town, and his wife Villadine. Well, Span and Villadine lived on Prune Street in Pinole. And Span's barbershop was on San Pablo Avenue. Well, Emmett would go there and hang out there, and he would bother everyone when they came in the barbershop and tell them, you know, this guy can't cut hair. He can't even cut grass right. Why are you letting him cut your hair? Span would just go on cutting hair and ignoring Emmett. Just to give you an idea of his philosophy and his homespun wisdom, one day I was in the barbershop and I about fell out of the chair. This individual named Clifford Hughes came in. Now, Clifford Hughes, you have to understand, there were certain individuals when I was growing up in Pinole that had fallen on hard times, divorces, alcoholism, so forth. They hung out in Fernandez Park. There was Clifford Hughes, John Scanlon, Emmett Walton, Charlie Roof. And by the way, Charlie Roof was a friend of Max and Buddy Bear, the boxers, and he had them come to Pinole, and they were hanging out at the Antlers with him sometimes. One day, as a child, I was walking through Fernandez Park going to the creek, and I tripped over this man I thought was dead, lying in the park. And I ran home screaming to my mother, and she called the police, and the constable came. And he wasn't drunk. George Henderson wasn't dead. He was just drunk. So this was my initiation to the rogues in the park. But one day, Emmett Walton was in the barber shop, and Clifford Hughes came in, and Clifford needed a drink. He needed a drink real bad. He said, "Span, I'm sick." He said, "I am so sick." He said, "Give me some money for a drink, please. Please, I've got to have a drink." And Span, cutting my hair, didn't miss a lick, said, "Rub salt in your ass, that'll cure you." So that's the kind of town I grew up in. These are some of the characters I grew up in. Emmett passed away in the 60s, but he was quite an individual. He knew a lot about town history. I'm going to move into the saloons of Pinole. Drink first. I might mention the stool that Jeff is sitting on. This stool was from the Antlers Tavern. It was a stool that probably was put in there in the 40s or 50s. I remember the color of the stool because I had my first drink in the Antlers. I turned 21, a martini, and I sat on a blue stool. So I know that that was a blue stool. It seemed a lot higher when I was younger, and getting off it was a lot harder at that time too. But just to give you an idea about the saloons in Pinole, there were many saloons in Pinole, and the pictures you see up here, this is Andrew Swenson and his wife Anita Swenson. They were one of the first owners of the Antlers Tavern. Now, it was not always called the Antlers Tavern. In 1899, it was Charles and Mary Alvarez's store. It was first a store, a dry goods store. And then it was taken over in 1900 by the Lehman Brothers and became another department store. It wasn't a saloon yet. But in 1910, Pinole was growing because Hercules Powder Company, which was the former California Powder Works, was growing also. Lots of people were coming into Pinole. And if you had a saloon on what we call the Four Corners, which we'll see in a few minutes, between Tennant Avenue and San Pablo Avenue, that was the ideal place to have your saloon. And there were many saloons with many unusual names. One of the first saloons of the Antlers was the Swenson and Lewis Saloon. And this was Mr. Swenson, Andrew Swenson, his wife Anita. She was a granddaughter of Mariano Vallejo. So she was quite prominent at the time. He teamed up with a relative of mine named Manuel Lewis. So the saloon was called the Swenson and Lewis Saloon. That was the first name of the Antlers, the Swenson and Lewis Saloon. They operated that saloon until about 1916. And at that time, the saloon changed hands. It changed hands to another town character, a man named Jack Squeaker Silvis. Now, he was called Squeaker Silvis. Do we have his picture, Jeff? He was called Squeaker Silvis because when he talked, he had a squeaky voice. As I said, just about everyone in Pinole had a nickname. This is Jack Silva on the right. And when I was growing up, he was elderly at the time, but he had a barn along Tennant Avenue. He had a big white stallion that he loved, that he kept in that barn. And the Eagles Hall, where the community center is now, a theater, used to keep their windows open and have dances at night on Saturday nights, but the smell from his barn and the stallion stable used to come over and upset the people at the hall. But Jack Squeaker Silva loved that horse, and every parade in Pinole, he was in front of the parade on that horse, that big white horse. Now, he also had another unusual hobby, and that was collecting heads of animals. And therefore, that's how the Antlers got its name, because Jack Squeaker Silvis had moose heads, cinnamon bear heads, deer heads, elk heads. There was a full-size deer stuffed in the window of the Antlers. And I understand it was first called the Stag before it was called the Antlers. So it was Jack Squeaker Stilbus who first gave the Antlers his name. And since then, the Antlers has had a number of different owners. If on the right here, this is one of the earliest saloons in Pinole on Tennant Avenue. Try to picture Tennant Avenue as being a very important place going down to the Southern Pacific Railroad. Because when you came into Pinole on the Southern Pacific Railroad, the Walton family would pick you up in their Surrey, rain or shine, and bring you into Pinole. That was the taxi. The Waltons operated the first Pinole taxi by horse and buggy. But when you came into Pinole, you came under the trestle from the Southern Pacific under the Santa Fe Railroad. Now, the Santa Fe did not come in until about 1900, so it was a little later than the Southern Pacific. But there were a number of saloons along Tennant Avenue because when people went to go away from Pinole down to the Southern Pacific, that was the last saloon they saw. And when they came to Pinole, into Pinole from the Southern Pacific up to uptown, you had this saloon, the First and Last Chance Saloon. And this was my Uncle John Vincent saloon. And he operated that saloon for about 1904. That saloon was built on Fernandes' property. He bought the lot from Fernandes, put in his saloon. Now, you can see John Vincent on the right there. He had a big mustache. That was my father's uncle. His saloon was very interesting for a number of reasons. One of them being that it burned down in 1924, but under mysterious circumstances, apparently someone threw a cigar in the sawdust on the floor, and during the night the cigar ignited and burned up the place. But just coincidentally, my father's uncle John Vincent's home burned down in Byron too, many years earlier before he moved to Pinole. So anyway, it was quite an accident, and it burned down at that time in 1924. I might mention that John Vincent was a very unique individual for a number of reasons. He was one of the ones who operated saloons along Tennant Avenue at that time. And I can tell you a few other things about him. In 1909, there was a big temperance movement against alcohol. The women's temperance movement was formed. And it never really went anywhere in Pinole because Pinole had so many saloons and so many men, boarders, single men from Hercules, working at Hercules, drinking in the saloons. To give you an idea of what the town was like in 1910, you had articles in the newspaper like C.P. Silvis says, who was the poundmaster, any more livestock caught running throughout the main towns of Pinole will be impounded. We cannot have this anymore. There was a plank sidewalk running in front of John Vincent's saloon, going from Tennant Avenue all the way down to the bay, down to the Southern Pacific Depot. And a young lady caught her foot in a loose plank and fell and bruised herself greatly and tore her dress on that plank. And that was front page news in 1910. I mean, this was the kind of town it was. And Mr. Lewis's grocery store, his grocery boy delivering groceries in town, found a purse with $50 in it and returned it. I mean, it was a very honest town at that time also. So this was John Vincent's saloon, and it burned down in 1924. But before that, what happened in Pinole was the 18th Amendment. Now, if you're familiar with the 18th Amendment, that was a prohibition at that time. Now, my Uncle John Vincent was caught and fined 3 times for making home brew and getting caught by government agents. And he had to appear before the magistrate in Martinez. I found the records, and it wasn't a very happy time for him. But you had to change the name of all the saloons in Pinole to soft drink establishments. They could not be called saloons anymore. So they were all called soft drink establishments until the 18th Amendment was repealed, I think by the 19th Amendment, I believe. I'm not positive. So anyway, picture of saloon in Pinole. This was a 1910 article in the paper in 1910 also, that someone did not tie their horse down outside, and a horse walked in through the swinging doors into the saloon in Pinole and dropped dead. So that's the kind of town Pinole was. It was a town full of saloons, and this was another saloon along Tennant Avenue. Now I might mention this home is still standing. This is the Collins home, Margaret and Marie Collins. It was the home of their father, John Collins. Now John Collins and his wife, Julia, they came to Pinole probably in the late part of the 19th century. And this is the second home. In 1908, Pinole suffered one of the worst fires ever. The whole town almost went up in flames. It was a town built of wood with wood stoves, and accidents were very frequent. Fire department responses were not as fast as they are today. And this house was close to where the Antlers Tavern is today on the west side of Tennant Avenue. There was the Antlers Tavern, and then you had the American Hotel, and then you had the Forester's Hall, and then you had the Collins home, which was built of wood. This is stucco now, but imagine the same home of wood. Well, in 1908, the American Hotel burned down, and it almost burned the whole town down. How the Antlers Tavern was saved, I don't know, but it was. The Swenson and Lewis Saloon was saved. But the American Hotel was not, and John Collins' house was burned to the ground. Now, interesting enough, John Collins, when he came to Pinole, before he had his saloon, he operated a tonsorial parlor. A tonsorial parlor meaning a barber shop. So I'm beginning to think that he also had a tailor shop and a barber shop in his house in the downstairs before he had his first saloon. Now we know John Collins was a town constable in 1902, and again he was elected in 1906. So he's quite a civic-minded individual. Before you could, by the way, we'll see in a few minutes, before you could get a saloon permit in Pinole, you had to apply for a liquor license. And this is one of the main sources of revenue for Pinole, were liquor licenses. Now, John Collins' house, we'll go back to that in a moment, but this house was built in 1909. Now, John Collins died in 1909. And he left behind 7 young children. Now, Margaret Collins, who became superintendent of the Pinole District, was the youngest of the 7 children at that time. And his brother Jerry took over the saloon business and later married the widow and helped, she had 3 more children, helped to raise the family. But John Collins, when he was alive, this is John, he operated a saloon here. The family lived upstairs, and downstairs was the Klondike Saloon. This was the name of the Klondike. So the Klondike was here, and John Vincent's saloon was down here. And John Vincent's saloon was the first and last chance saloon. Again, when you left Southern Pacific, it was the first chance you had to get a drink. When you left Pinole, going home in the Southern Pacific, the last chance you had to get a drink also. Interesting enough, at the first and last chance saloon was one of the first robberies in Pinole in 1913. These 2 fellows were gambling in John Vincent's saloon, and apparently got to know one another, and they went out for a walk down by the bay, and the 2 guys took out a billy club and clubbed him down and had to get 20 stitches from Dr. Fernandez and stole a $20 gold piece from him. So that made the front page headlines at that time, big robbery in Pinole. But these are the liquor licenses, and when you applied for a liquor license, now these are in 1904, I believe. Yeah, yes. And you can see E.M. Downer was a town clerk at that time. This is a petition of John Collins. This was probably the first time he applied for a liquor license for the Klondike Saloon. And in order to get a liquor license, you had to get approval from a number of individuals who owned liquor stores in Pinole or who owned saloons in Pinole. And I might just mention that if you owned a hotel in Pinole, you sold liquor. If you owned a barber shop in Pinole, you sold liquor. If you owned a cafe in Pinole, you sold liquor. So liquor was sold by everyone. And so this is one of the ways we know of who had a saloon in Pinole at that time, by seeing who are the ones here who vouched for him getting a liquor license in Pinole. And you might say, well, gee whiz, why would they want to have competition? But these fellows all knew one another and knew that there was plenty of business for everyone, so why not, share the wealth? Some of the names on here, you see Lefevre on here. There's one of the early Lefevres. There's Swenson, here. And I've seen a number of individuals on the liquor license applications of Pinole that I recognize their names of having saloons in Pinole. Now, this is the prestigious Four Corners in Pinole, as you can see here. Here's 10th Avenue running down to the bay. Now envision that there's a plank sidewalk going all the way from here down to the bay. And in 1916 there was a huge flood and that plank sidewalk floated out into the bay. So they had to make do. Here's the Antlers Tavern. Here is another early saloon. This is the Golden West Hotel and Saloon. Here, vacant lot. This was McGuire's Saloon over here. And if you got a saloon on one of these four corners, that was the main place for doing business in town, because that's where the action was in Pinole, along the four corners. Over here was the White House Saloon owned by the Stats brothers. This was Swenson and Lewis Saloon, again around 1910, before it became the Antlers. This saloon, the Golden West Hotel, this was torn down about 1958. It was built, I found it was built in 1913 by Jimmy Silva. Here's Jimmy outside reading his paper. And here's his saloon, the Golden West Saloon and Hotel. And here you see it here in the probably 1930s, 20s or 30s here. But it wasn't built until 1913, but it was on one of the four corners. So you had the Golden West Hotel, you had McGuire's Saloon here, you had, right here you can see Stats. Jeff, can we go back to that one? Well, this is the Stats right here, the Stats White House Saloon on the corner here.
In the preceding one, though, there's a church up on the right, top right.
That's Catholic Church, Pinole, St. Joseph's Church, yes. But this saloon now had many other owners also. Afterwards, it became, during the 1930s, a Traveltura Hotel, or pardon me, Traveltura Cafe. And here we are here, Joe Lunge's Traveltura Cafe. People came from all over, jammed Highway 40 or San Pablo Avenue to come to this restaurant. And here is the bar in the Traveltura Hotel. Here it is in the 1950s. It was called the Town Tavern then. Right here, when I was growing up, that's where the paper boys sat and rolled their newspapers. That's where we all sat. And my first job was cleaning the windows of the cleaners here. I got a job cleaning the windows at the cleaners. I won't tell you how long ago that was. It's a while back. And here's the inside of the Traveltura Cafe, or later on the Top Cafe. Very beautiful building. Again, one of the unfortunate casualties of modernization. Now here we have the Antlers. This is the Antlers, how it looked around when it was remodeled around 1910. Okay, and it stayed this way for quite a while. And we're looking down 10th Avenue. There you can see the Santa Fe Railroad. Right next to the Antlers, in between there, that's the American Hotel. That's the one that burned down, that almost burned the whole town down. That is the Forester's Hall. That burned down in 1908. It was replaced by the Pinole Opera House, which burned down in 1931, unfortunately. And there is the Klondike Saloon over there. Over on this side, that's the Walton livery stable there. And down here is a commercial hotel. Here is the White House Saloon owned by the Stats brothers. This is where today Tina's Cafe is today. Pinole went through a rebuilding process before World War I. Before World War I, Pinole was a wild town of saloons and Saturday night goings-on. But all these were made of wood, which burned down quite frequently. So around 1914, you had buildings. The first building, for example, the Bank of Pinole was built of stone, masonry, and you had the Downer building built of brick. And you had the roof building on San Pablo Avenue built of brick also. And this was replaced by a brick building, which you see today as part of Tina's. This, during World War II, this is the Antlers Tavern was owned by this lady, Lucille Dallamaso Cafarete. I did not know her. But you can still see Jack Squeaker Silva's influence. The animal heads everywhere. In fact, if you go in the Antlers today, there's still a big moose head that was there when I was a kid. And it was full of sports memorabilia also. That was a bar where the guys from Hercules hung out. No young guys were in that bar. Very, very few. It was a tough bar. Another bar in Pinole, we had many, but one of the more memorable ones is where today is the Bear Claw Cafe it was. This was Manuel Marcus's bar. Here's Manuel Marcus. He was one of the Portuguese entrepreneurs. Many of the Portuguese that came to Pinole first worked at the Hercules Powder Company. My grandfather, for example, Charlie Vincent, worked in the nitric acid department. He got his face burned by nitric acid. He said, "The hell with this." And so he went into the saloon business. And so with his brother John Vincent and his uncle Manuel Lewis. They were all in the saloon business. Well, the fellow that lived on Prune Street, whose home is still on Prune Street, it's a very long, one-level, beautiful home remodeled, was Manuel Marcus. And this is Manuel. And his saloon was one of the main saloons along San Pablo Avenue. And all I heard it called was, it was a Manuel Marcus bar or saloon. But you could go there and play pool, as you can see here. And it was quite an elaborate place, and we have a lot of nice pictures from family members who remember that. Now, Manuel Marcus was interesting for a couple of individual reasons. One is he had a big family. He had a big house. And it's at the corner of Prune Street and San Pablo Avenue. If you go down there today, you can see it. It's painted brown, and it's remodeled very nicely. It's still standing. But he had 8 boys. And his wife was pregnant again. And he said, "I've got a baseball team." Had a girl. So the 9th one was a girl. So Manuel Marcus also owned the commercial hotel. Do we have a picture of that, Jeff? Okay. Here's a commercial hotel, one of the oldest hotels in Pinole, built around 1900. It could hold 40 boarders. Now, it also held some bawdy individuals, I understand. And so, you know, if there was prostitution in Pinole, I understand it probably was in the hotel. And of course, it was unknown to Manuel Marcus what was going on there, I'm sure. You could get a room there for $20 a month. Meals were served at all hours, all kinds of meals, and it could hold up to 40 boarders. And this was one of the earliest in town. It did not burn down. It was torn down by Bernardo Fernandez once he purchased it, and then he donated the park to the city of Pinole. Across the street, right there, there's the First and Last Chance Saloon. Here's that dirt road called Tennant Avenue. Here's that plank road leading down to the bay, and here's a guy walking on it. This is one of our most treasured pictures. And here's a horse and buggy going down to the bay.
Was there a hotel next to your dad's house there?
Yes.
Is that
yes.
the picture?
You can barely see it. I didn't mention it. Yes, John Vincent's hotel was next to John Vincent's bar. Yes, he had a large hotel there. There was a bakery there, a tailor shop. There was also a shoemaker shop there, and so forth. Most of the early saloons in Pinole advertised fine spirits, wines, brandies, cigars, whatever you wanted. It was kind of a men's town, you know. There were ladies in Pinole, but in the evening time, it was a pretty wild place. I just might mention that during 1918, the great Spanish flu epidemic in Pinole and Hercules, many individuals died, and everyone, the law was that you were put in jail if you did not wear a gauze mask on the streets of Pinole. Men, women, and children had to wear gauze masks, or they were jailed, at least threatened to be jailed. However, there was a dispensation for the saloons of Pinole because that's where the money was made. At 7 o'clock, you could open the saloons. Didn't need masks.
I'm sorry, could you go back? Could you orient us on the bottom picture?
Sure. There's a commercial hotel. There's what Sonny was just referring to, John Vincent's hotel. There's John Vincent's bar, the First and Last Chance Saloon. As we go up the street, here is the Collins home. I don't have my glasses on.
Showing Quinlan Street.
Quinlan?
That's the one. That's the
Yeah.
street you see.
No, this is Quinnen here. This is Quinnen.
And then the Brant homes are in that?
Oh, no, the Brants are back there.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are the Brants. Now, this was taken just after the school was built, around 1905, 1906. You see there's no trees there. So this is a pretty old picture, probably around 1906, 1905. There you see that's the Forester's Hall. And when that burned down John Vincent's, the Klondike Saloon by John Collins right here. John and Julia Collins. And she had to raise those 7 little children by herself. So this is Quinnen Street, named after one of the superintendents of Hercules Powder Company. By the way, these homes are still standing today. Quinnen Street's kind of a backwater of Pinole where a lot of old Pinole homes have been saved and remodeled. Let me get a quick drink here. This is the Alibi. When I grew up, it was known as the Alibi Saloon. Now, before that, my grandfather, Charlie Vincent, ran a saloon there in 1905 to 1910. My family ran a butcher shop right here. Lewis and Vincent had a butcher shop here. But
What corner is that?
this is Fernandez Avenue, where it meets San Pablo Avenue here. Now the picture you're looking at is the Great Flood of 1958, the last big flood in Pinole before the Corps of Engineers fixed the creek. And there were no more huge floods after that. You see a 50 Ford right there. When I was in high school, I remember the flood very well because Tennant Avenue was a river. We were living along Tennant Avenue. And I remember the fire chief pulling up in a boat to our front porch and asking my mother, "You want to evacuate now?" Because the water was way up to the front porch and going to come into the house. And my mother said, "I'm not leaving." So but I can still see that boat on our front porch. I wish I had a camera to take a picture. But anyway, this was Charlie Vincent's saloon, and my grandfather lived down the street on Fernandez Avenue between Fernandez Avenue and Prune Street. So he didn't have far to go to walk. It was purchased by Valpera, this individual here, and in the 1930s it was known as the Gondola Restaurant, Gondola Cafe. Now, I found this on eBay, on the internet, a matchbox from the Gondola Cafe of the 1930s. I don't know who had it. Somebody back in New York had it for sale, and I said, well, I'll snap it up. The things you find on eBay. Gondola Cafe, Contra Costa County, most beautiful lounging room, the real Italian dinners, 75 cents. Okay, lunch is 45 cents. We're proud of our mixed cocktails. Well, this individual, Big Red Lefevre, I'm sure I drank many a happy drink with him because I worked with him at the old Pinole School, assistant custodian. Actually, he gave me more work to do. My title was assistant, but what are you going to do when your boss tells you to work? This is one of my good friends, and his family still lives in Pinole, and wonderful man. Anyway, the Gondola Cafe became the Club Alibi, owned by Mike Lewis. And in the 50s, this was a beautiful place to be. How many of you remember the Club Alibi? Oh, look at everybody remembers the Club Alibi. All right. And they had a Chinese restaurant in the back where you get Chinese food. Well, do you remember the girl? If you ever went to the men's restroom, you remember her. Yes. For novices, those that came into Pinole, you had to bring them to the Alibi because you had to see their looks on their faces. So you brought them in the Alibi, and then you bought them a few drinks, and then they had to use the bathroom. Well, when you went into the men's room, you opened the door, and they had set up a mannequin, a woman, sitting on a toilet with a ball gown on. And they had it so that she had a roll of toilet paper in her hand, and then when they opened the door to the men's room to come in, she raised her hands up with the toilet paper, and they looked like they were in the wrong, restroom. Well, some of them didn't even know the difference because it had so much to drink, you know, I mean, sure. But that was a big trick. And a few years ago, I tried to find that mannequin, but it was sold at a Salvation Army store up in Grass Valley. Someone bought it for $300. It was for sale for a whole year, and I didn't know about it. You know, so she's gone, but her memory lives on. So this is the 1958 flood, and then today this is it was owned by the Gazano, and that's all been torn down. This is another old cafe in town, and another old saloon. This is Tommy's Cafe. Now, Tommy took over from the Manuel Marcus Saloon, where the Bear Claw is today. And this is Tommy. He took over in the late 1940s, and he married my mother's niece, Gladys. So Tommy and Gladys ran the cafe. This is his brother, Walt, here. And this is the same bar that you saw when Manuel Marcus was there. And it was there when I was a kid growing up, too. So this is Tommy's Cafe, and this was all through the 50s and 60s. If you wanted a good drink and you wanted good food, you went to Tommy's Cafe, Tommy's Coffee Cup. Oh, going from saloons to barbershops. Just to give you an idea of individuals in Pinole, this individual was Ignacio Martinez. Here you see him in his barbershop in the late 1920s. This is in Concord. It's one of the few pictures we have of him. But this is Ignacio when he lived out at the Adobes in Pinole Valley. Now, he and his family were very poor at that time. This was 1906, 1907. They moved in there after the earthquake, and the earthquake had knocked down most of the adobe. And they lived in a one-room part of the old adobes, crumbling adobes, and the beams in the adobes, they put, my mother remembers as a girl, they put ropes and put blankets over them and divided them into rooms. And they lived in there, and they took care of the adobes and cleared the grass and grounds for Bernardo Fernandez, so that people in Pinole went to the adobes. Going to the adobes was going to the picnic site, and they made it into a beautiful picnic site. It's by where the dog park is today. On the right side, you can still see some of the picnic area there today. There was a big dance floor there, and all the locals would go out there and dance. And we do have a movie of their dancing on the dance floor there, and someday we'll be showing it here, hopefully, at the Historical Society meeting. But Ignacio Martinez was the grandson of Don Ignacio Martinez, who owned El Rancho Pinole. And he was born in 1849. He was born at the rancho in Pinole Valley. But he fell on pretty hard times, he and his family did. And by 1907, he had moved to the adobes in Pinole and lived out on the adobe ranch. But he had learned a trade because he had gone from being a ranchero. He was an expert horseman. He drove 8-horse stagecoach. He also went to San Francisco and drove horse cars in San Francisco, like street cars pulled by horses over there. Made $1.50 a day doing that. But he learned the tonsorial trade in San Francisco. He learned to become a barber. And that was his skill for the rest of his life. He was a jack of all trades, but he loved to barber. And when he came to Pinole and lived out in the valley, one of the things he did was, during the evening, he would come into Pinole on Saturday nights to barber. Now, if you look at him, he's hiding his left hand. You notice that? He lost 3 fingers of his left hand when he was hunting in Martinez near the John Sweat vineyard, and his gun blew up. His shotgun blew up. The cartridge did not eject and blew up in the chamber and took off 3 of his fingers, so that even the locals in Pinole remembered when he was cutting their hair that it felt funny to feel his 2 little fingers running across your face. But in every picture, he always tries to hide that deformed hand. I wondered about that till I found the article in the paper from 1905 where he blew his fingers off. Anyway, he was called a bunda barber. Now, a bunda barber would take his razor and clippers and chair, and he would set up a chair in downtown Pinole along the streets. And if you want a cheap haircut, that's where you got it. Shave, 15 cents, haircut, 25 cents. In the more expensive parlors, 50 cents for a bath. Now, Saturday night was the big night, and the barber shops and the saloons all stayed open. He also sold liquor, by the way. And the barber shops and saloons all stayed open till 2 a.m. in the morning because all the ranch hands from all the valley ranches would come in for their baths, their shaves, and their drinks. So Saturday night was a big night in Pinole for barbers as well. But he was one of the first barbers in Pinole. And he set up his little, and his 3 brothers were barbers also. One was in Martinez, one was in Concord, and another one in Walnut Creek. So they kind of set up shops in different communities. Now this barber shop is pre-World War I. As you can see, look at the beautiful decorations, the mirrors, the chairs, the floor. the door with the stained glass panels in it here. This is the Antlers Tavern. Now my belief is when the Antlers Tavern was first built as a dry goods store, that they also had a barber shop in it, and they just left the barber shop when they converted it to a saloon in 1910. At least that's my thinking. And the barber shop, you could drink in the saloon and then come through the door in the barber shop, get your hair cut, and go through the door, back to the saloon, get another drink afterwards. So each one benefited the other. Now, this particular individual is Benjamin Christian. He was a barber in the pre-1920s and probably predating World War I. But this is the Antlers Barber Shop. It's not as it looked when I was a young boy getting my hair cut there. But I might mention that John Collins' home that we saw, the Klondike Saloon, his family had that rebuilt in 1909 after the Great Fire, and then they stuccoed it in 1930 so it wouldn't burn down again. But he also had a barber shop in that building on Tennant Avenue, and that was run by a man named Jimmy Russo. Now, Jimmy Russo was one of the first barbers in Pinole. I don't know a lot about him, but his family has contacted the Historical Society, and hopefully we can get some pictures from him in the future. So this is the Antlers Barber Shop as it looked pre-World War I, probably around 1910, right after it was remodeled.
The gentleman who gave you that picture, that was his grandfather. His oldest daughter married Manuel Marcus.
Oh, he did. Okay. Did you hear that? His oldest daughter married Manuel Marcus, so his oldest daughter was the mother of Manuel Marcus' baseball team.
That's right.
All right. Nice to know.
You can see the customer's shaving marks on the back wall.
Yes.
And
Yeah,
George,
look at that.
If you were a good customer, you left your mug there.
yes. And George, he said the door, see the door? That door went back to where the kitchen was. And to the left of where the cups are hanging is where the stairs went up to the top floor. And the picture was taken right in front of the door on Tennant Street looking in to the bar.
Okay.
He described it to me about the picture. But and then when I went into the Antlers with this picture, people who had had their hair cut in that barber shop showed me how the stairs went up, and you can see where it cut into the ceiling. Because the Antlers this split the Antlers as we know it today from the back.
Now, the Antlers was remodeled. You saw pictures of how it looked in 1910 and 1916 with a cupola on the top. But it was remodeled, but there were rooms that were rented upstairs in the Antlers. So you could rent rooms upstairs in the Antlers and live up there, then come down the stairs, get your hair cut, or do your business in the saloon. Barbershop, a book that had many of the advertisements of early businesses in Pinole in 1955. Now, for some of us, 1955 does not seem that long ago. That is true. Okay, yes it is. Yeah, just a while back, just a click, back when Mickey Mantle was playing baseball, and just good times in the 50s. Anyway, here's my Uncle Span's advertising in the Span's Barbershop. We cut ladies' hair, hours here. It pays to look well, Span said. And you can see some other things here too. Lewis's Bookkeeping, Pinole Light and Power. I don't have my glasses on. It's Ed Hoke. Yeah, Ed Hoke, manager. By the way, Ed Hoke, his nickname was Spoons. He lived above the Antlers. That's where he lived. Okay. The Marquee, another saloon in Pinole at that time. Rodeo, pardon me. The Marquee is still there. The Marquee, and I think, what is the restaurant below it? The restaurant? Ricky's, right. I knew you'd know that, Marcia. Valentine Cleaners, Chat and Chew, lots of early businesses in Pinole. One story I want to tell you about Span's Barbershop. Now remember I told you Span, Emmett Walton, Pulley Pants Walton, the character, would come into Span's, give Span a bad time, all the customers a bad time. Span used to say he went out of business because of Emmett. But he kind of liked Emmett, and Emmett liked him because they used to rib each other all the time, something awful. I mean, I couldn't even tell you some of the things that I heard. Now, I'd go home, my mother said, what do you want to go to that barbershop for? They have to go to confession now on Saturday. you know. But anyway, one evening I should say, Span was working late, and he asked Emmett to take his wife, Span's wife, Villadine, home down on Prune Street. They lived on Prune Street by the creek. And Emmett said he'd take her home. So you can picture Emmett walking in front of Villadine. Villadine was a very, very short lady. And Villadine, like Emmett, had a little too much to drink. And so anyway, they were walking down Tennant Avenue toward Prune Street, and Emmett looks behind him, and Villadine's not there. She's gone. So he runs to the police station and says she's been kidnapped. She's been kidnapped. Villadine has been kidnapped. And they had everyone out looking for Villadine. Well, upshot of the situation was Manuel Marcus's house by the Catholic Church. There's another house there, the Barrett House, and there's a lot there with a lot of bushes in it. Well, she had fallen into the bushes and was lying in the bushes, but everyone in town thought she had been kidnapped and was looking for her, but thank goodness she emerged from the bushes. They found her in the bushes and all was well. But I mean, that's the kind of thing that went on in this town all the time, okay? Because you had a population just in the low thousands at that time. Now here you can see we had other barbers in Pinole. There's Joe's Barber Shop. When I was growing up, the barber shop, the Antlers Barber Shop, that was the main barber shop in town. There was a long wait there on a Saturday especially. And it was very popular, and Joe was the barber. I remember there was a Joe the barber, then later on there was Al the barber at that time. So he advertised also here, closed on Monday, Saturday, 9 to 5, okay, hours Tuesday to Friday. And again, we have some other things. Ed Lefevre, as you can see here, was in real estate. And Arms Groceries on Tennant Avenue, where Blackie's is now, that was Arms Groceries. Or Blackie's, there's no longer a Blackie's chicken there, but that's where it was. So, you know, Top Cafe in Pinole, okay, that was on the corner of San Pablo and, pardon me, Pinole Valley Road. That was the Top Cafe. Hemleb, Edward Hemleb, he was one of the town dignitaries. He was the insurance agency, and he also was a good friend of our family. So it's kind of interesting looking at the different advertisements from this town. Bromley's was very popular in Rodeo at that time, and a Pinole Garage. Silva's Shoe Repair. Any of you remember Silva's Shoe Repair? Yes. Remember the little shoe shop where Gazzano's place is now? Yeah, that was quite a thing. He was a guy that really, a little Portuguese fellow that could really fix your shoes well. We had a shoe shop, we had tailor shop, we had everything just about.
Last slide.
Okay. These are in 1970, we found a map of Pinole, and these are all the barber shops that Pinole had in the 1970s. So you had Bill's Barber Shop on Pinole Valley Road, Joe's Barber Shop, that's the Antlers Barber Shop on Tennant Avenue, Johnny's Barber Shop out on Meadow Avenue, Marty's Barber Shop on Terra Hills Drive, Parkview Barber Shop on San Pablo Avenue, Span's Barber Shop, my cousin Span still has his barber shop here, and the Wagon Wheel Barber Shop on San Pablo Avenue. I'd forgotten about that one. So we had lots of characters in town, we had lots of barbers in town, we had lots of saloons in town. And early Pinole was kind of a fun place to grow up in, but we didn't know there was any other place. I remember, and this is God's truth, I remember when I wanted to go outside Pinole, I got to the city limit sign and I started shaking. I would not go beyond the city limit sign. Okay? It's just something about growing up in a small town where everybody knew everybody else and everybody else's business, you know, that I would be breaking, my parents would find out before I got home. I knew it. And the first time I escaped from town was I got on the Greyhound bus at Louis Roof's store, and I went to the Rodeo Theater by myself in Rodeo. 25 cents to get in. And I remember I saw Tim Tyler's Luck. I remember that, a cereal, Tim Tyler's Luck. But anyway, it was fun growing up in Pinole, and many of you remember, I'm sure, some of the saloons. Pinole had many saloons in in the early days, mainly because of the Hercules Powder Company and all the men and all the people that came into town, until the 18th Amendment made everyone go dry, and we had nothing but soft drink establishments and bathtub gin. And just to give you an addendum to the story, my Aunt Rose lived in Newman, and her husband owned a hotel in Newman. And one day during Prohibition, this fella came in and asked her husband for a drink. He said, well, we don't serve liquor here. You can't serve liquor. This is Prohibition. He says, I'm sick. I am so sick. He says, sorry, I can't give you anything. He says, please, just a small amount. You must know where I can get something. Eventually he gave in. He gave him a shot glass full of liquor. They put the cuffs on him. It was a revenue agent. They lost their hotel. The government confiscated their hotel. And they lost everything, and she had to move back to Pinole. Yeah, I don't know if that was a good thing or a bad thing. I guess it was a good thing. But back then you had to be very, very careful, because I remember my father telling me stories when he was a boy that at the First and Last Chance Saloon and at Charlie Vincent's Saloon, where the Alibi used to be, that guys would come in and want to know where they could get a drink. And my dad said his father told him, you tell him you don't know anything, there's no drinking, we just serve soft drinks, and that's it. That's all we serve here. Thank you. No, thank you, thank you.
So I said it
Any
earlier.
questions? I didn't know.
I'll say it again. What would we do without George Vincent?
Yeah, what would we do without him? Yeah. Tell my wife that.
He knew about half the people who were in the slideshow we just saw, and he was related to the other half. And what he doesn't know is that we have petitioned the United States government to have George placed on the National Register of Historic Persons.
Oh, yeah.
So we are waiting to hear.
Yes.
Very soon.
Sure, yes.
So,
Hysterical persons?
right. So, are there any questions for George? Yeah. Okay, I'm going to hand the mic back to you.
Where can we get a drink, George?
Yeah.
That's what we should do to get money for the society, is to open up our own saloon so we can get a museum, a place to keep. The bank would be an ideal place, and if the governor of California would see fit to not worry about taking over all the redevelopment properties, for the state, that maybe we could have some history that we could call our own. Because someday in the future, our society now is nice, and we're doing well, and we're working hard, and we're trying to get members, but we have gaps, and we have feast and famine. So someday we need a place, a central location that people can call their home of history in Pinole. I'm sorry, your question?
Was it the wagon wheel that turned into the Green Lantern farm?
No.
Was it the Club Tropic?
She wanted to know if the wagon wheel turned the Green Lantern. No. The wagon wheel was formerly Hunter's Inn. It was out where the Embers is in that area today. Yes. Now the reason I remember is when I was 11 years old, my grandmother lived on the ranch out there where Bradshaw's is. Bradshaw's used to be Scanlon, or my mother's side of the family's property. And they had to sell, some of you remember that little, it was on American Graffiti. They used to have a big green dinosaur, the miniature golf out there. Well, that little section, my grandmother had to sell to pay taxes during the Depression, or else they would have lost all their property. So that was part of our family's ranch at that time. But in I won't say when, about 1948, I was a little guy, and we went to visit my grandmother, and it was raining like tonight, but really storming with lightning and thunder. I remember looking out the window, seeing a flash of lightning, and they had a huge oak tree out in the barn. The oak tree went up out of the ground. The barn went up in the air, and all of a sudden everything crashed and got dark, and all the electricity went out. There was a tornado or a twister came up from the bay, and just missed the house we were in, and took the barn, took the tree, just ripped it right out of the ground, and went up where Hunter's Inn is, flattened that place, which was the wagon wheel now, or used to be. Went up San Pablo Avenue and twisted those huge power poles at Chevron. There's pictures we have of them that look like spaghetti, just twisted around. I think that was one of the first Twisters in Pinole. But I remember seeing it, just, I can still see all of a sudden, look, the flash of lightning in the tree going out of the ground. Yes?
George, I remember a barber named Cinco, and I don't see him up there.
Yeah,
Cinco the barber.
Oh, Cinco, is Cinco still working? He was in the Parkview Plaza down here, I think.
So he was at Parkview,
Yeah, Parkview Barber Shop. No, I think he was more in the 60s or 70s, probably, Cinco, right? Was that right?
He did my kid's hair.
Yeah. What is the fellow's name that's down there now? I know his name, I can't think of it. Gig's Barber Shop. That's where Cinco used to be, where Gig is today.
Where is 75 Old Meadow Avenue? That's where the old Playtime Club was?
Repeat the question.
She wanted to know where Meadow, 750 Meadow Avenue. That could be near the Playtime Club. Now, some of you don't remember the Playtime Club. That was on San Pablo Avenue. Near Meadow Avenue, actually, it was in that area. Yeah, on the corner. It was across from the Pee Wee Golf, kind of. I know when I used to left my Uncle John off there, and about 2 or 3 in the morning, he would go over there. Yeah.
George, I look at a couple of those phone numbers, and one is kind of interesting, the 758-9919. The 99s were paid telephone. And I guess that was a paid telephone in that barber shop.
Oh, okay. Yeah, very interesting. Yeah. Something
The others may have been.
of interest, yes.
Is it true that the old maid quite a bit of his money by making a cop out here and getting tickets to the highway when it used to be old Highway 50? Giving tickets to the people that didn't stop for the stop sign.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah,
My father no doubt when he was very upset.
in 1964,
Right down the bottom, people would, speed coming down.
you're right.
Right.
Yeah, he had a Harley Davidson three-wheeler. He used to hide behind the signs. He's talking about Lon Buck in around in the 30s and early 40s, before Officer Hugh Young became our one-person constable or one-person police officer. I remember reading where Lon Buck issued 30 citations in one day in Pinole,
It was a perfect trap because
going through Pinole.
bottom of the hill and coming down both ways.
Pinole was a speed trap.
No warning.
Everyone seemed to know about that. In 1964, I was driving from across to Las Vegas. What's that town that you launch from before you go to Vegas? What's that called? You remember the town? What is it?
Where were you?
Oh,
Left from Bakersfield to, how far were you?
Barstow. Thank you. Yeah, Barstow. Anyway, my car broke down about, out in the middle of the desert at 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I had to walk 2 miles. I was hitchhiking. No one was picking me up. Road runners running by me and so forth. I thought, my God, I'm going to die out here like the pioneers in Death Valley. Finally, a surfer from Los Angeles picked me up. God's truth, guy with a surfboard, picked me up and gave me a ride into this little town called Jean, Nevada, which was outside Las Vegas. And it was a little nowhere place. You couldn't find it. There was just a little gas station there with about 100, 200 cars there. And I asked the fellow, I said, how come all these cars are here? And he said, when people leave Vegas, they don't have any money. And this is the last place where they can get money. They sell me their cars so they can get home. And I buy them real cheap. But I had to stay there 4 days so they could ship the part. I needed a fuel pump from Las Vegas. So the guy that was working on the fuel pump said, where are you from? And I said, well, I'm from a place you wouldn't know it. I said, where is it? Pinole, California. He said, oh my God, he said, I got a ticket going through there in 1942. So you're right, yeah. Yeah, Pinole, the main source of revenue was, getting tickets.
You had to come through Pinole if you were going from Oakland to Sacramento.
But we didn't get a stoplight till 1949. So before then,
You must have got a ticket.
yeah.
Did you get a ticket?
Okay.
Father-in-law did.
What about the Hercules, the powder plant? They had some explosions out there, didn't
Yes, that's another story, yes, yeah. That's
What years those are?
one of the big ones in 1948. I'll just tell you my own experience. I was about 8 years old. My sister, I remember, was in the bathroom. I remember it very well. No, I was younger than that. I was about 3 years old because my mother was giving me a bath in the kitchen in a tub, I remember. My sister was in the bathroom in the other room, and all of a sudden there was this huge explosion. All of the windows in our house blew out. The door blew in. We had a huge door, it blew in. My sister was screaming in the other room, and all of the cups and saucers came down into the bathtub where I was, and the salt shakers and everything else. So I remember that explosion very well. That was around in the 40s, during the war.
Blew out the windows in the old school.
Right, the old school. That's one of the reasons they planted those eucalyptus trees at the old school in Pinole, was to shield the windows of the school from the explosions from Hercules that would blow in the windows. It wasn't just to beautify the school, it was to protect it from the, at that. The last big explosion was in the late 1950s. In 53, yes, and it killed a lot of the 12 individuals. Hanson was killed. Joe Ramus. It was a very. I was at Scouts that night. I remember we canceled our Scout meeting because of the explosion. I saw it. I was walking out Pinole Valley with a Scout camp out there with the Scouts, and all of a sudden there was this huge mushroom cloud, a huge bang at the black powder plant, I believe, or the nitroglycerin, one of the two. Yes, the Hercules Powder Company quite frequently blew up, and a lot of individuals lost their lives in that. That's.
Shut it down, huh?
It just changed hands, became a fertilizer plant, and then today a residential area. Yeah, it's just the flow and ebb and flow of time changes things, pretty much. But I think that's another program. Anything else? Anyone would like to ask another question about it? Yes?
George, you mentioned that a lot of these businesses seem to change hands frequently. Like you mentioned, they were opened and in like 4 or 5 years they were changing hands. Do you know anything about why they change hands so frequently?
I could only make a few guesses. I think there's what we call recessions sometimes. Businesses declined, or there were too many shops that were open, or partnerships failed. That was a frequent thing. The family decided they didn't want to be in business anymore. My family stayed in the saloon business for a long, long time. They were in the saloon business way up in Copperopolis in the 1890s, even up there. But I would think it was for a variety of reasons, probably economical more than anything. And some personal too, because, if your family was a saloon owner, well, there was a strata of society in town too, and you were contributing to, there's a big temperance movement in the early 1900s. The women's temperance movement was very, very strong. So I think there was pressure, to cut down the number of saloons and individuals visiting them.
Might mention that the demise of all those barber shops eventually was credited to a 1910 invention by a guy named Gillette.
Did you hear what John said? He said the demise of barbershops was credited to an invention by a fellow named Gillette. But I think you have to understand also that the barbershop and the saloons were places of male bonding. These were the man caves of the past. I mean, you went there not so much for the haircut, but for the socialization. That's where I grew up hearing things I'd never heard before.
And some medical care as well.
Yes, yeah. I might mention that the barber pole that you see, maybe some of you are familiar with it, that came from blood and bandages, the red and white, because the barber used to be the town surgeon or the town doctor, and in the old days, and then they would take those bloody rags and put them on the clothesline to dry off, and they would flap around. So when you saw the red and white, that meant blood and bandages, meant go there, get your teeth pulled, get little bloodletting if you needed bloodletting if you were feeling bad. Oh, I'm sorry, thank you. Yes, she brought in a number of old razors here that you might want to look at later. These are some of the razors that I would be scared to have someone But that's the way things were done back then. And that's probably part of the charm of early Pinole was its barber shops, its saloons, and the characters that frequented them. And there's a lot of characters in town now, so here's one of them. Thank you.